The diagnosis of Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD, is more than just a medical issue. It reflects how we understand and respond to human diversity. My journey began with a simple question. Why do so many children remain invisible in a system that is supposed to embrace them? What I found was a maze of cultural, social, and institutional barriers, but also an extraordinary possibility for change. This is the story of how I faced these barriers and fought for a fairer and more inclusive diagnosis, confronting resistance, doubts, and my own limitations. The story begins with my nephew James. He was only 3 years old when my sister started to notice something different. He wouldn't respond to his name, avoided eye contact, and preferred to play alone. As a neurologist, I knew these could be signs of autism, but the doctors she consulted said he was just shy and that he would develop in his own time. That was not what happened. James was diagnosed at the age of 6, too late for interventions that could have made a significant difference. My sister felt guilty for not insisting earlier, but the truth is, the system failed her and James. This experience sparked something inside me. Working in the field, I saw how diagnostic criteria often overlooked important nuances, treating children as statistics rather than individuals. In the following years, I immersed myself in autism research. I read everything from Leo Kanner's pioneering studies to the latest revisions in the DSM. I realized that autism was not a static condition. It was a spectrum, a diversity. However, the diagnosis often seemed to seek a single, fixed definition, ignoring cultural, socioeconomic, and even linguistic factors. It was in this context that I received an invitation to the International Neurology Congress in Boston. The main theme was the revision of ASD diagnostic criteria in the next DSM. The idea of being in the same room with some of the world's leading experts was exciting, but also intimidating. I knew I would have to fight to make my voice heard. The atmosphere at the Congress was electrifying. Doctors, psychologists, and researchers from all over the world roamed the halls, discussing ideas that could shape the future of diagnosis. The opening lectures were a historical review, starting with Kanner and Hans Asperger's early observations to the latest controversies. It was fascinating but also frustrating. While listening about universal models of diagnosis, I couldn't help but think of James and the children who didn't fit into these models. During the coffee break, one presentation caught my attention. Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, a Japanese researcher, was advocating for the use of genetics combined with behavioral analysis. His approach was bold, but the audience was divided. Many argued that genetics was too expensive to be applied on a large scale and could introduce a dangerous bias in diagnosis. Despite the criticisms, I saw potential in his idea. Later, in the hallway, I was approached by a tall man with tired but determined eyes. He introduced himself as Ryan Carter, the father of a child with autism. "Dr. Coleman," he began, "I know you're here as an expert, but I need you to listen as a father. My son was diagnosed too late, and it cost us precious years. Something needs to change." Ryan's words echoed in my mind throughout the night. He invited me to meet with other parents the next day, but before that, there was another round of lectures. The day began with a panel on the challenges of applying universal criteria in different cultures. A study comparing diagnoses in urban communities in the United States and rural areas in India revealed a striking disparity. While American children with mild symptoms were frequently diagnosed, Indian children with clearer signs often went unnoticed. In the discussion that followed, one researcher commented, "Diagnosis depends on context. In some cultures, a lack of social interaction is seen as shyness, not a symptom." That comment disturbed me. How could we create universal criteria when cultural context had such a significant influence? During the break, Ryan found me again. "Did you see that study?" he asked, holding a brochure with detailed charts. "This is what I'm talking about. Kids like my son are being forgotten because the system only works for those who fit the mold." That day, I decided to accept his invitation and joined the meeting with the parents. It was a simple room, lacking the sophistication of the Congress. People spoke candidly, sharing stories that ranged from late diagnoses to doctors who simply didn't believe them. One mother, visibly emotional, shared how her son was diagnosed only after a severe crisis at school. one that could have been prevented. These stories deeply affected me. As a doctor, my focus had always been on the technical aspects, but there, I saw the human impact of what we called system failures. Ryan thanked me for listening, but said something that stayed with me. "Listening is good, doctor, but what are you going to do with this?" The next morning, I returned to the Congress with a renewed sense of purpose. During a Q&A session, I raised my hand and directly asked the panel, how can we create criteria that are truly universal if we're not considering the impact of cultural, linguistic, and economic factors? My question caused discomfort. One of the speakers answered evasively, mentioning that these were issues for future revisions. But I knew we couldn't wait. I decided I would do something about it, even if it meant going against the status quo. At the end of the Congress, Dr. Tanaka approached me. "I heard your question," he said, "and I agree. We need a more inclusive approach. If you're willing to collaborate, I have some ideas that might interest you." It was the first time I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. The journey home was marked by a whirlwind of thoughts. The voices of the parents from the meeting, the disturbing data presented at the Congress, and my conversation with Dr. Tanaka echoed in my mind. I knew something had to change. Yet, Ryan's question kept playing in my head. What would I do with all this? On my first day back at work, I sat down with Sophia Turner, my colleague and longtime partner. She was a respected clinical psychologist with a practical approach and an unmatched ability to understand the nuances of children and their families. I explained everything: the Congress, the studies, the conversation with Tanaka, and the meeting with the parents. She listened attentively, tapping her fingers on the table, something she did when she was deep in thought. "Ethan, you're talking about reshaping an entire system," she said finally. "It's ambitious, but I'm not sure if it's possible. We're dealing with a structure that's been in place for decades." "I know it's a huge challenge," I replied, "but we can't keep ignoring what's clear. The current system is failing. We need to find a way for more children to be seen and helped." Sophia remained silent for a few moments before nodding. "If we're going to do this, we need data. Real data from real people in real contexts." That's when we decided to start a pilot project. Our idea was simple but bold: to test revised diagnostic methods in an experimental school that served children from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. We selected a school in the city center, where children from various cultural and economic contexts interacted. We knew it would be a challenging environment, but also an ideal place to test our hypotheses. We spent weeks structuring the tools we would use. We adjusted behavioral assessment scales to include interviews with parents and teachers, as well as direct observations of the children in the classroom. We also developed a system to record cultural and linguistic factors that could influence the children's behaviors. The first days of the project were intense. We observed the children's interactions, interviewed their parents, and analyzed the data we collected. The patterns that began to emerge were revealing. Children in vulnerable contexts frequently showed signs of autism that had been ignored or mistaken for behavioral problems. On the other hand, some children from more privileged families were being diagnosed based on mild traits that could be attributed to other issues, such as social anxiety. One of the most intriguing cases was that of Miguel, an 8-year-old boy from an immigrant family. He was introverted and avoided interacting with peers, but his academic performance was good. The language barrier made communication with teachers difficult, and they described him as disinterested. However, our observations suggested that Miguel might be on the autism spectrum. It was a diagnosis that, without our adjusted methods, would likely have been overlooked. Sophia started to see value in what we were doing, but not without reservations. "Ethan, we're making something that's already incredibly difficult even more complicated," she said one evening. "I'm not saying we should stop, but we need to make sure that what we're creating is useful and practical for the doctors who are on the front lines." Her words weighed heavily on me. I knew she was right. The project was still in its infancy, and the criticism was already inevitable. Our work began to attract attention within the local community, bringing both support and resistance. While some parents were excited about the idea of more inclusive diagnostic methods, others expressed concerns about how this could affect their children. One mother, visibly skeptical, asked during a meeting, "What if you decide my child isn't autistic? Does that mean he won't get the support he needs?" This concern was not unfounded. The autism label often came with access to essential services. Our tool needed to balance accuracy and sensitivity without leaving anyone behind. This was a technical and ethical challenge that became more evident with each new case. Another obstacle came in the form of institutional resistance. The school that had welcomed us began questioning the time and resources we were demanding. They argued that our project was disrupting the teachers' routines and creating conflicting expectations among the parents. Meanwhile, Sophia and I started to diverge in our approach. She was becoming increasingly concerned with the emotional impact of our methods on the families. "We're dealing with lives, Ethan," she said during a meeting. "We can't treat this like an academic experiment." "I understand that, Sophia," I replied, trying to stay calm. "But if we don't move forward with these tests, we'll never know how to improve the system." It was at that moment that I received an unexpected email from Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka. He was interested in our progress and wanted to collaborate. Tanaka suggested integrating his AI tool into our project, using the data we had already collected to enhance the analysis. The proposal was tempting but also risky. Accepting Tanaka's collaboration meant drastically changing the direction of the project, adding a layer of complexity that could alienate funders and participants even further. Sophia wasn't enthusiastic. "We're trying to solve a problem with more technology," she said, clearly frustrated. "The parents don't need algorithms. They need answers that make sense for their lives." Despite her reservations, I decided to move forward. I knew it would be impossible to please everyone, but I believed that Tanaka's tool could bring the breakthroughs we were seeking. He arrived at our lab a few weeks later, bringing renewed energy and innovative ideas. The first test with the AI was revealing. Miguel, who had previously been an uncertain case, was identified with a high probability of being on the autism spectrum, and the analysis suggested specific interventions that could help him overcome linguistic and social barriers. Another case, Chloe, a girl from a wealthy family, was identified as neurotypical, but with interaction difficulties that could be addressed without a clinical diagnosis. These results brought new hope for me, but also created new tensions with Sophia, who decided to temporarily step away from the project. With her absence, I realized how much I relied on her to bring balance and humanity to the work. Despite the early successes, the path ahead seemed more uncertain than ever. With Sophia away, the weight of the project seemed to double on me. External criticism became louder, and internally, decisions were harder to make without her balanced perspective. However, with Tanaka now on the team, the energy in the lab gained new momentum. He was methodical and extremely focused, but also knew when to take risks, something I admired deeply. We started by integrating his AI tool with the data collected during the pilot project. The tool cross-referenced behavioral information with genetic patterns, providing more detailed insights than we had ever achieved. It was like putting a magnifying glass on the cases, amplifying subtleties that had previously gone unnoticed. A clear example was Miguel. The AI not only confirmed our suspicions that he was on the spectrum, but also suggested that his social interaction difficulties were directly related to the language barrier and the school environment. Based on this, we developed a personalized recommendation to place Miguel in smaller groups and use bilingual teaching techniques. His parents' reaction was moving. "Finally, someone is looking at him as a whole," his mother said, with tears in her eyes. As the results began to show promise, we also faced resistance. A local group of educators questioned the use of AI, claiming it could dehumanize the diagnostic process. I tried to explain that the technology was not a replacement for traditional assessments, but a complement. Still, the distrust remained. These criticisms reflected the feelings that Sophia had expressed before stepping away. I began to wonder if we were losing something by focusing so much on accuracy and efficiency. At the same time, Tanaka encouraged me to continue. "Innovation always faces initial resistance," he said. "The important thing is to show results." That's what we tried to do. We organized a presentation at a partner school, this time fully incorporating Tanaka's tool. We demonstrated how AI could analyze data quickly and in detail, allowing for more consistent diagnoses. Some educators were impressed, but others remained skeptical. A principal asked directly, "And what about the children who don't fit your criteria? Will they be forgotten?" The question hit me like a punch. It was a reminder that no matter how advanced the technology, it could never replace human sensitivity. Despite the criticism, the presentation opened important doors for us. We were invited to present our tool at a regional neurodevelopment event. For Tanaka, it was a golden opportunity. For me, it was a chance to address the doubts that continued to arise. The presentation was tense from the start. We showed the progress we had made with the integration of AI and presented concrete cases, such as Miguel's and Chloe's, to illustrate the benefits of the approach. However, the questions that followed were incisive. A doctor from the audience questioned the practical viability of the model. "Do you really expect public schools with limited resources to be able to implement a tool like this?" Another pointed out potential ethical implications. "What about the risk of genetic data being misused?" I knew these were valid concerns, but I also knew that the resistance wasn't just technical, it was cultural. Tanaka tried to address the more technical questions, explaining how the AI could be adjusted to work with limited data. I, on the other hand, focused on the human impact. "This tool isn't perfect," I admitted, "but it's a step toward a more inclusive diagnosis. Our goal isn't to replace professionals, but to give them more tools to see what often goes unnoticed." Although some members of the audience seemed convinced, others remained firm in their criticism. When we left the stage, I felt the weight of their judgment. Tanaka tried to lift my spirits. "You've planted the seed. They just need time to accept it." Things became more complicated when I received a call from the experimental school. They decided to end our partnership, stating that the project was interfering too much with the academic routine. It was a harsh blow, especially since I knew this would limit our access to new data. To make matters worse, the funders began to pressure for more concrete results. They wanted to know if our approach would be viable on a large scale, and I didn't have a definitive answer. It was as if the project was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. It was at that moment that Ryan reappeared. He had been following our progress from a distance and asked to meet with me. During the meeting, he suggested organizing a press conference to present the impact of the tool from the perspective of parents like him. "People need to hear the human side of this story," he said. I hesitated at first. The last thing I wanted was more public exposure. But at the same time, I knew Ryan was right. We needed to show that our work wasn't just about numbers and algorithms. It was about children like his son, who finally had the chance to be understood. The press conference was an unexpected success. Ryan told his story with passion, highlighting how early diagnosis had changed his family's life. He also spoke about the limitations of the current system and how our tool offered new hope. His words had an impact I couldn't have predicted. The criticism continued, but now there was also support and, more importantly, attention. Soon after, Sophia reached out to me. "I saw the press conference," she said, "and I realized I might have been too harsh. You're doing something important, Ethan. I want to help." Her return brought a new energy to the team, and together, we began preparing for what would be our biggest test yet, a presentation at the World Neurology Congress. We knew this would be our chance to convince the global community, but we also knew we would be under the most intense scrutiny of our careers. Everything was at stake. The World Neurology Congress was more imposing than I had expected. The grandeur of the event was reflected in every detail, from the main auditorium, which accommodated thousands of people, to the level of participants, which included some of the biggest names in the field. Stepping onto that stage felt like stepping into a battlefield, where every word would be dissected, every idea would be tested. Tanaka, Sophia, and I worked obsessively in the days leading up to the presentation. We knew we needed more than just data to convince that audience. We needed real stories, human impact. We decided to highlight emblematic cases, like Miguel and Chloe, to illustrate the advances achieved with our hybrid approach. When our moment arrived, I took a deep breath and walked to the center of the stage. The room was silent, but the tension was palpable. I began with the story of James, my nephew, explaining how his late diagnosis had inspired my journey. I connected this personal experience to the challenges faced by parents like Ryan, highlighting the flaws in the current system. Tanaka followed, explaining the foundations of the AI and how it complemented traditional methods. He detailed how the tool cross-referenced behavioral and genetic data, adapting to different cultural and linguistic contexts. The practical demonstration was the highlight. We showed how the tool had identified Miguel, recommending specific interventions that changed his social dynamics. We also highlighted Chloe's case, illustrating how the model avoided an unnecessary diagnosis, preserving resources for those who truly needed them. When we finished, the silence turned into murmurs. The initial reaction was mixed, but that was expected. The questions began, and they came loaded with skepticism. A renowned researcher raised his hand. "Dr. Coleman, how do you plan to implement this tool on a large scale, especially in low-income communities? And how do we ensure that genetic data isn't misused?" I had anticipated that question. "Our tool doesn't replace traditional methods," I explained. "It complements them by offering a deeper and more inclusive analysis. As for the use of genetic data, we have taken stringent measures to protect privacy and ensure that the information is used exclusively for clinical purposes." The questions continued. Some were constructive, but others seemed more interested in finding flaws than exploring possibilities. At one point, one of the panel's most outspoken critics said, "This all sounds great in theory, but it seems like an elitist solution. How does this help diagnosis in the real world?" Before I could respond, Sophia took the microphone. "As a psychologist, I work with families every day," she said, her voice firm. "And I can tell you, these families aren't asking for perfection. They're asking for a chance. This tool offers that chance." There was a brief silence, followed by some applause. Sophia's statement brought humanity to the discussion, something I couldn't have done on my own. When we left the stage, exhausted, we weren't sure how our work would be received, but we knew we had done everything we could. The next morning, I received an unexpected call from a representative of a private foundation. He was impressed with our presentation and wanted to fund the expansion of the project. It was the validation we needed to continue. With the funding secured, we began to expand the project to 5 countries. Our priority was to test the tool in different cultural and economic contexts, from urban areas in the United States to remote villages in India. The results were encouraging. The tool demonstrated consistency in identifying autism cases, even in populations that had previously been overlooked. Miguel was one of the first to benefit from the new model. With the right support, he began interacting more with his peers and even became the leader of a small reading group at school. His mother, in a message she sent us, wrote, "You didn't just diagnose my son, you gave him a voice." As the project gained traction, new challenges arose. In some countries, cultural barriers still hindered the acceptance of the diagnosis. In others, limited access to technology made the implementation of the tool slower than we had anticipated. To address this, Sophia suggested creating simplified versions of the tool that could be used in places with fewer resources. "Not every place will have access to cutting-edge technology," she said, "but we can create something that is functional even with fewer resources." Her idea was a game changer. With Tanaka, we developed a compact version of the tool that eliminated the need for genetic data and focused solely on behavioral patterns. This allowed schools and clinics in more remote areas to adopt the model. Over the year, we presented the results to several international organizations. While the criticism continued, there was growing recognition that our approach was a significant step forward. Some of the leading health entities began considering the inclusion of aspects of our model in their guidelines. However, for me, the most impactful moment was when Ryan organized a community event to celebrate the progress. Parents, educators, and children gathered to share their experiences. A 7-year-old boy, recently diagnosed thanks to the tool, handed me a drawing he had made. On it, he had written, "Thank you for finding me." It was at that moment that I realized that all the effort, all the criticism, and the obstacles had been worth it. The diagnosis was just the beginning, but it opened doors that had previously been closed. At the end of the event, Sophia pulled me aside. "Ethan," she said, "this isn't the end. We have so much more to do. Personalized interventions, ongoing support. We can go beyond diagnosis. I smiled. You're right. This is just the beginning. As we left the event, I felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The world was still imperfect, but we were moving forward. And for me, that was already a victory.